Welcome to episode number 61 of 100 Plus, an overview of 100 of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, Western civilization, the Christian faith, and you. Our hope is that by tracing the path that led us to this moment, we will not only gain a better understanding of this moment, but that we will also be able to better follow Christ, to do so more thoughtfully and faithfully. Today's topic is slavery, with a particular focus on William Wilberforce, a British evangelical, longtime member of Parliament, a member of the Clapham sect, and a friend of William Pitt, a prominent 18th century British Prime Minister. Wilberforce was also one of the most vocal and persistent advocates of the abolition of the slave trade in the West in the 18th century. As you will hear, indeed as you know, slavery, that, quote, peculiar institution, is a great stain on mankind, on the church, and on the West, and it remains an ongoing issue. Thankfully, as the idea of human dignity spread, there were significant movements to end the slave trade and eventually to end slavery. We now turn to one of history's darker moments, slavery. We also turn to one of history's brighter moments, and that is the people who marshaled together to bring it to an end. Among the reasons I raise the topic of slavery here, as opposed to a little later when we get to the Civil War in the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln and all that he did, is because of William Wilberforce, a small, privileged, glad-handing young Brit who was moving further up the high society of the British Empire. He emerges here. We will pick up on the topic of slavery in future podcasts, most immediately again on the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln, and then as we move through the 19th and 20th centuries, we'll focus more specifically on racism, on Jim Crow, civil rights legislation, Dr. Martin Luther King, many others who were engaged in this process. But I'm kicking the discussion off here because it's bigger than the United States. Indeed, it's bigger than the West. And because of Wilberforce. This is where he jumps onto the scene as a rich kid, as a party animal, when two things happened. First, at the age of 25, which was 4 years after he had already been elected a member of Parliament, he had a significant and life-changing conversion to Jesus Christ. Second, under the mentorship of several people, most famously John Newton, a former slave ship captain who himself had become a Christ follower and then a pastor. Newton is most famous for writing the hymn Amazing Grace. His role in Wilberforce's life is developed a bit in the 2006 film Amazing Grace, which I recommend. It had been a while after his conversion before Newton fully engaged in trying to wipe out the slave trade. But when Wilberforce came to Newton looking for pastoral counsel, Wilberforce was thinking that now he probably needed to quit Congress and become a pastor. Newton very wisely said, stay in Congress and use your influence to do everything you can to bring an end to the slave trade in the British Empire. So before we jump into the Wilberforce part of this story, let me make a few introductory points. It's important that we recognize that slavery has several forms. For starters, there are different kinds of slaves. Historically, most people become slaves for what is labeled political reasons. That is, their village or kingdom or country is overrun by another power. They are captured and forced into slavery. Most of the major empires of the world not only enslaved the people they conquered, many of them also enslaved some of their own citizens as well. In addition to political slaves, there are also economic slaves. So in the case of the African slave trade, you became a slave as part of someone else's business plan. You were captured or bought from your parents, perhaps, who had fallen into debt and had absolutely no other way forward, and then you are sold to slavers. I would put sexual slavery here, mostly women and young women at that, are kidnapped and beaten and forced into the sex trade. in order to make money for their pimp. The second category of economically driven slavery happens to those who fall into debt. If you could not pay, you might be sent to debtor's prison, or you might be forced to become an indentured servant for some period of time in order to pay off the debt. So there are different ways that people would fall into slavery and lose their freedom. A second distinction that we need to make about slavery is that the term plays out on a spectrum. At one level, you have slaves who are treated as cruelly as can be imagined. They're beaten, they're sold, they're separated from their families, they're sexually abused, they're underfed, whatever. The only restraint on the cruelty of the slave owner is that the slave owner often does not want to have their property die because that would ruin their investment. So on the one hand, you have slaves treated in absolutely as horrifically as you can imagine. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are essentially employees. They're simply not free to quit the job. And in the Greek, you actually have two different words that play out here. The word for servant is diakonos, from which we get the word deacon. There's also a word for slave, doulos, and this is a word that means a slave. Jesus and Paul will identify in different ways as being a slave. So we then also need to recognize that slaves can be distinguished based on the kind of work that they are forced to do. You have slaves that are forced to work as laborers out in the field, or perhaps you have slaves that are forced to do domestic work, maybe trusted with a little bit more responsibility. And then, of course, you have sexual slaves, which remains a growing, large, sort of unthinkable crisis even today. And then you also have a couple other categories of slaves. So you have child slaves, and then you have slaves based on racism, which is America's story. Not uniquely American, but it is certainly America's, quote, original sin is slavery, and that slavery was racist at its heart. So the second thing that I want to say about this category, this whole topic of slavery as we move into it, is that the topic is very suddenly contentious. So the first point is that there are different kinds of slaves because of how they fell into slavery, what they do, that kind of thing. The second is that we need to note that discussions about slavery, and I'm thinking here particularly slavery in America's past, remain contentious because the past, or at the very least, the stories we tell ourselves about the past, remain very important. One of Faulkner's best known lines is, "The past isn't dead, it isn't even past." I've been marveling over that this past year as debates about history and who tells it have never been far out of the news. So let me pause here to note just for a moment, there's a sense in which the past isn't past because racial issues remain a present day issue. We have ongoing discussions and debates and clashes over justice, over terms and how these terms are going to be defined, over what kind of systems are in place, over theories like critical race theory. We have fights over whether or not our society should be colorblind or not. This past year seems to have been particularly divisive following the death of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and others. So look, I want to note that a lot of these discussions are not discussions. They're just two sides not listening to each other, trying to shout the others down. I want to suggest that we can do better than that, but we have to go after these issues. And again, I also want to suggest these are present day challenges. This past week, F.W. de Klerk passed away. So de Klerk was the last ruling leader, white leader of apartheid South Africa. He is the one who led this officially racist government. I say officially racist. It was a race-based government structure. South Africa, between 1948 and the mid-90s, recognized 4 different classes of people. There were whites, there were blacks, there were mixed, and there were Indians. And basically, the whites, who were a minority, had power. De Klerk is famous. He released Nelson Mandela, who had spent 27 years in prison, and almost immediately, it wasn't de Klerk's plan, but almost immediately, de Klerk was sort of pushed aside in the election in which Mandela ran for president, and there was just an overwhelming groundswell that ushered Mandela into the presidency. So the point in all this, and de Klerk and Mandela sort of jointly won a Nobel Peace Prize as they sort of navigated a mostly peaceful transition of power. I share all that to say, look, de Klerk just died. I mean, these are ongoing. These issues of race-based justice and other things are very present, and so things are really hot. And by the way, while we're talking about this, these are very current. If you have not read the book written by Ron Hall and Denver Moore called Same Kind of Different as Me, it's a story about Denver Moore. It's a story about a man who, I think he's still alive. He grew up as a slave in the South. And obviously slavery had ended with the Civil War and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, but word did not get to Denver and the others in this place. And so he eventually runs away, shows up as a homeless man in Dallas. He's a pretty rough guy in Dallas. He's a homeless guy. He has no education. He really doesn't understand the world. And he is befriended by a woman, and I won't go into too much. She ends up with cancer, but it's a true story in Denver, and this woman's husband, Ron Hall, writes. It's powerful. Laura Bush, I think, writes the foreword. I highly recommend it. But when I say that the past is not past, I'm not suggesting that the events happened chronologically closer to us than you might think. I'm just noting the power of the stories we tell ourselves to shape the present moment. And there's another way to make this point, and again, it's very up to the moment. The Chinese government just elevated their premier, Xi Jinping, to the mythical status alongside Mao Zedong. And in the however many years, nearly 1,000 years, there's been some sort of Chinese dynasty. There have been only a few that have reached this most elevated status in terms of the vantage point of the communist Chinese government. And Xi Jinping has just received that. So this past week, the Congress sort of bestowed on him, basically, I mean, it looks like he's going to be, dictator for life. But one of the things that they did is they agreed to a new official history. And so they have essentially officially rewritten the history, and you'll be surprised to hear in their 500-page history, like 150 pages of China's 1,000-year history gets devoted to Xi Jinping. And so it's because you want to control the present and the future, you have to control how the story of the past is told. So I'm saying a few things here as we wade into this. I am saying, one, that there's different kinds of slaves. I'm saying, two, this is a contentious topic. The third thing I want to say is that I really want us to take what amounts to an unblinking look at this topic. So this is an awfully long setup, and I would apologize, except I think it's necessary. We have to deal with the facts. I'm not interested in avoiding the disappointing news that I need to report about how Christians have responded in the past. I'm not willing at the same time to cancel people from the past, which entails not giving them any attention because we don't like their position on something. This whole project, these whole 100 lectures, is designed to walk through the past. It's not an exercise in spin. It's designed to walk through the past as it was. We need to understand what happened. We need to take an unblinking look at what happened. This means realizing some good people did some bad things, or some bad people did some good things. During the past few years, there have been public protests about monuments honoring Civil War heroes from the Confederacy, and other protests of other honors given to 18th century figures, most notably George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, because they owned slaves, which they did. And so there is a sense by some that they need to be canceled, and that we need to not listen to anything that they said, or they need to be sort of defaced. There's even been some that have suggested that Abraham Lincoln should be canceled. He did not move quickly enough to end slavery. This whole project, this 100-lecture walk through the past, is not an exercise in spin. We need to understand what actually happened. We must take an unblinking look at what happened. This means realizing some good people did bad things and some bad people did good things. During the past year, there have been public protests about monuments honoring Civil War heroes from the Confederacy, and then other protests over statues and honors given to 18th century people who turn out to have held racist beliefs or to have owned slaves. And most prominently, this would point to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who did own slaves. There's even some who speak ill and think we should cancel Abraham Lincoln because he didn't move quickly enough to end the slave trade. Some now refuse to study people like this, believing that if they held these views, everything they touched is toxic, and that we need to rename everything that was named after them. Look, no, I wouldn't go there. I do think there are good reasons to go back from time to time and look at some of the people who have monuments made in their honor. And I do think there are times then, after we learn more things, that it's agreed upon. You know, after further review, the ruling on the field is reversed, and this person, because of what they did, because of what they said, for other things, this is not someone that we should honor. I think there's an important role for politics and local discussions and other things to try and work those things out. I have no disagreement with that. However, when it comes to the study of history, when it comes to trying to figure out what happened in the past so that, again, we can live better today, we cannot avoid information from people we don't like. We have to go after it, and we have to understand that nobody except Jesus lived a perfect life. So if we're going to start canceling people for things that they said or mistakes that they made, history is going to get short, I guess. Now, you might think that all this goes without saying, come on, Woodruff, get on with it. Or you might think, oh my goodness, I had no idea that you held those kind of views. You should be canceled. So let me just say, your response to what I've said may depend upon when you graduated from college, because there has been a pretty seismic shift in the approach to this. While I'm here, let me say that we have to deal with information we don't like, whatever that information is. If you listen to radio stations right now, you see that some newscasters on the right report the news in such a way that the right does everything right and nothing wrong. And if you listen to other radio stations, you hear that those on the left do everything right and nothing wrong. No one offers nuanced or modest views. Okay, dear listener, that was a joke, or at the very least, it was a test. Of course, some people offer nuanced views. My statement, my complaint that no one offered nuanced views was designed to be exactly the kind of statement that you have to be alert to. People make these statements and they're not true and they're not helpful. It would be nice to live in a world where the good guys were very easily identifiable and the bad people were very easily identifiable, and you always knew who was good and who was bad. That's not the world that we live in. The truth is, we all do some mixture of good and bad. To cite the famous Alexander Solzhenitsyn statement, if only it were all so simple, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and to destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Okay, so again, this has been a long setup. Perhaps you didn't need this apologetic for history or wading into contentious topics, but I felt the need to say a few things before we wade into our topic for today. The study of history is not an exercise in spin. Our politics should not shape our study of history. It should be the other way around. What we're going to see as we look at the topic of slavery is that the story is complicated and mixed. The church did things right and it did things wrong. The United States founders did things right and they did some things wrong. In other words, they were just like you and me. So today, 5 big points. Number 1, slavery has been a part of the human story throughout history. No society has been immune. If you read about the ancient Egyptians or Assyrians or Muslims or Greeks, if you read about what went on in Africa or Asia or South America, you're reading about societies that had slaves, sometimes a lot of them. This makes things complicated. Consider Rome, the Roman Empire. It was an amazing empire. We should marvel appropriately at the fact that somehow the Romans managed to hold things together and have some dominance on the planet for almost 1,000 years. We should marvel at the Pax Romana. We should marvel at some of their architectural feats, such as the aqueducts and the Colosseums. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that are impressive about the Romans. But we need to realize Roman society was harsh. It was very Darwinian. Our amazement needs to be matched by horror. It was a brutal life. People had rights if they were rich males, and pretty exclusively Romans. Most of what they built on the backs of slaves, many of whom were treated as subhuman. Their entertainment involved watching people kill each other. They had gross sexual immorality issues. Step forward a few thousand years. Historians estimate that approximately 11 to 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Of these, 4 million went to Brazil, 2.5 million went to Spanish colonies, 2 million went to the British West Indies, and 500,000 to the United States. My point being, slavery has been a human horror for all of history in virtually every society. And by the way, it remains so. The stats about modern-day slavery are horrifying. The UN claims that 1 in every 200 people today is some sort of slave. I see other numbers that are lower than that, but I don't see numbers that are lower than 40 million. Christ Church has been working on some slavery-related issues in 2 different places. I have been both of them. In Ghana, for the last 10 to 15 years, we've been working with international needs, and there we came along with a longer-term strategy. So what was happening was that there was a practice out in the undeveloped areas of Ghana that was still going on, in which a a religious leader, a shaman, a witch doctor would basically, as payment from a family that comes to him in crisis because their kid is sick or someone's about to die and they think that this is the only person that can help them, would extract in payment young women. 10, 12 years old, these girls then become sort of slaves. They're obviously going to be sexual slaves in addition to other things. And what International Needs said was that if we go in directly and we buy back these girls, or we kidnap the girls, then there's just more girls that are going to get forced into this. So they took a longer term strategy and they said we have to disempower these witch doctors. And so what we did was went in with clean water and medical care, and we built a big school, and we did everything to sort of educate people and provide them with medicine and provide them with clean water so they're not getting sick, so they're not running to the witch doctor, and disempower the witch doctor. In India, we were asked if we would pay for HBI, one of our other partners, this is up in the northeast side of India, if we would pay to build a daycare for the women who were being trafficked for their children. And again, I remember trying to wrestle with this. So we're building daycare, we're providing child care for the women who are being prostituted. Is there no other, really? And what was pointed out to me was that if we weren't providing, this was what the women that we were trying to help, and it's complicated. This is what the women we were trying to help were asking for, because otherwise their young children were in the room while they are servicing clients. And so it was like, okay. So I went over to, and we were, willing to put in, I think it was $25,000, and it was in the middle of a slum. And I remember standing there. It's this overrun area. There's actually a funeral pyre not 400 yards away. I'm looking at this body that's being burned. There's open sewer. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And there's, I don't know, there was people everywhere. Literally, it seemed like there was just people everywhere. And I said, if we buy this plot right here, who are you paying? Is there a title that we're going to get? And they're like, no, there's no title, but we'll pay these people and we'll get it. They'll make sure that we'll get it. And I was like, okay, look, I'm not certain we're not going to get taken, but we want to do what we can do. And these were people that had a long-term, our HBI partners have long-term plans. It ended up, they decided not to do that, but we have been involved in different ways trying to stop human trafficking, especially human sexual trafficking. So, point number one, slavery has been and remains a part of the human story. No society has been immune. Point number two, Christianity was born into a world of slavery and has a mixed record addressing it. On the one hand, the church missed a lot of opportunities to do the right thing. It was exhausting. Honestly, to read some of the accounts, some of the old accounts of people trying to justify slavery and to try and use the Bible to do so. I read, Abraham, the father of faith, had slaves, so did the other patriarchs. Canaan, Ham's son, was made a slave to his brothers. Slavery was widespread throughout the Roman world. We have no record of Jesus speaking against it. The Apostle Paul specifically commanded slaves to obey their masters. Two issues seem to get more ink than others. One is this story in which Noah's son, who is being punished, there's this weird episode, I think it's probably like Genesis 9, and Noah's son is being punished, and he becomes a slave. But the story that was told is that he's made black. And this story, there's nothing in the text at all to suggest any of this. But it was a story. By the way, we helped Christ Church through scholar leaders, an organization I've worked with now for 25 years. We helped fund a doctoral dissertation for a West African scholar to write his dissertation to refute this idea, because it continues to be used today that this is why Africans had been slaves. So that was a common thing. And the other passage from the New Testament that got a lot of ink was Paul in Ephesians 5, slaves, obey your masters with respect to fear. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with the sincerity of heart, as you would obey Christ. So this passage, first of all, the next thing that is said there by Paul is that the masters, you need to treat your slaves as you need to treat them well. You need to treat them as you would want to be treated. And additionally, you've got to understand slavery in that context. One, it wasn't racial, and secondly, it was not anything near as degrading as we have seen it in other places. So when you go through the New Testament, and when you go through church history, you see that the church is going to be, early on, is going to be a place where slaves and free, again, you can almost think employees and business owners in some contexts are going to be equal. And people who had been slaves are going to be elevated and become bishops in the church. And there's going to be a solid effort to undermine this practice. Additionally, you're going to see that as we move into the Middle Ages, in the 4th, 5th, by the 6th century, Christianity had largely sort of pushed down in Europe, had largely done away with most slavery. By the time we get to the 10th and 12th century, you've got very little slavery going on in Europe and in Christian settings, and you've got lots of very harsh commandments being made against it. Then we get into the 14th century, and the Spanish are going to sort of reconstitute slavery. The Spanish are exploring, and they're in the Canary Islands, and they're going to start to turn some of the natives into slaves. The Pope is going to immediately issue a decree that says, if you do this, you are excommunicated from the church, which was as close to him saying, you don't go to heaven when you die, as he could, but you're going to see that this is going to be ignored. So then we're going to see slavery really make this big comeback after that. So on the one hand, you've got the church you got aspects of the church, people in the church justifying slavery in horrific ways. At the same time, you've got lots of people fighting against slavery from early on and being crusaders against slavery from the very earliest days throughout history. Point number 3. Slavery made a comeback in the 16th century. By the late 1700s, English traders were raiding the African coast and capturing between 35,000 and 50,000 Africans a year. These men and women would be shipped across the Atlantic and sold into slavery. It was quite a profitable business, and many powerful people were dependent upon it. This is horrific, again, and it is particularly disappointing because it seems uniquely hypocritical. On the one hand, you have a, quote, Christian country, or a country founded on Judeo-Christian principles, where people are trying to follow the life and the teaching of Christ. And this is a country that is engaging in the slave trade. At the same time, it is uniquely disappointing because it's uniquely hypocritical, because you have a country whose leading document says that people are created equal. All men are created equal, and we all have divine rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet it takes away those rights from a whole group of people. Point number 4. In spite of a mixed record, Christians have done more to end slavery than anyone else. So, point number 1, slavery has been part of the human story for most of time. Point number 2, Christianity was born into a world of slavery and has a mixed record addressing it. Point number 3, slavery made a comeback in the 16th century. Point number 4, in spite of the mixed record, Christians have done more to end slavery than anyone else. Modern people studying history discover that the church has done better than they expected. In other words, have been advocating on behalf of people who are oppressed, fighting injustice, fighting to free the slaves, done more. There have been more Christians doing more good things than they might have known about. And at the same time, they also discover that Christians have done worse or been more backwards or slower to respond than they would have imagined. By the way, just as I set up the church as being better or worse, I think you could say the same thing about the United States. On the one hand, you have these founding documents that boldly declare that all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson, having been shaped in part by the Enlightenment thinking of John Locke, and in part by a Judeo-Christian underpinning, goes after this idea that people are in different classes. And he owned slaves. So on the one hand, Jefferson wrote this section that was dropped. He writes this in one of the initial drafts of the Declaration. And he goes after King George, and he said, King George, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur a miserable death in their transportation thither. So, on the one hand, you've got this great statement advocating against slavery. On this hand, you've got this. On this hand, this paragraph is dropped from the Declaration. It was found offensive to certain states, and so it was dropped. So I was at an event last night. I'm filming this on Thursday. I was at an event in Grand Rapids, Michigan on Wednesday night. It's an Acton Institute, and the founder, Father Chirico, Catholic priest, was stepping down after 30 years of being the president of this organization, and he was giving an address. And the Acton Institute sort of has lived at the intersection of morality and markets. So it's calling for a virtuous and free society. So it's calling for faith and virtue to influence society, but it's also calling a lot of economic freedom kinds of ideas. And he is making this address reflecting on over 30 years and talking about goods and bads. And he sort of singles out and he says, America had an opportunity at its founding, but for political expediency. And so he was calling on the people there were like 600 of us there, calling on us not to be politically expedient. He said, in an effort, he goes, in an understandable effort to sort of preserve this fragile unity, they made a deal with the devil, and they allowed slavery to get in. And so on the one hand, you've got this push to stop it. On the one hand, on the other hand, you've got a willingness to go ahead and to go along with it. I found lots of quotes from founders that are encouraging quotes. Benjamin Franklin says that slavery is, quote, an atrocious debasement of human nature. He and Benjamin Rush, one of the other early leaders, founded the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. John Adams said, quote, every measure of prudence, therefore, ought to be assumed for the eventual total extirpation of slavery from the United States. I have, through my whole life, held that the practice of slavery is abhorrence. In the Federalist Papers, number 54, James Madison stated that Southern laws Southern laws, not nature, have degraded the slaves from the human rank, depriving them of rights, including the right to vote, that they would otherwise possess equally with other human beings. Madison argued that it was barbarous policy to view blacks in the unnatural light of property, rather than as persons entitled to the same rights as other people. We can find similar quotes from lots of other people, Washington and others. In 1786, Washington wrote to Robert Morris and said, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I to see the plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." And later in his life, he freed several of his household slaves and decreed that at the death of his wife, his estate was going to be put into their care, that they would all be freed. However, so on the one hand, you've got Washington doing this, but on the other hand, he does not free them until after he died. On the one hand, many slaves were given the opportunity to earn their independence by fighting in the Revolutionary War. However, when America was founded, there were 500,000 slaves. Approximately a third of the founders had slaves, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson being most notable, and you've got this whole 3/5 of a person issue. Number 5. William Wilberforce is a key player in ending the global slave trade. So there are many others who will fight against racism in various ways and times. When we get to the 19th century, we'll look at Lincoln and Civil War, and you get into all kinds of other people. You've slaves that sort of rise up through the ranks. Frederick Douglass, there was just a movie I watched on the Underground Railroad. You've got lots of people. You've got, if you haven't read Uncle Tom's Cabin lately by Harriet Beecher Stowe, it was a profoundly influential book in the North to try and explain to Northerners what was going on with the slave trade and the slavery in the South. So lots of people will be involved, and we'll look at all that. But Wilberforce is a leading player here, and the reason we pick up this topic here is because in the middle of the 18th century is when he emerges. So this is the middle of the 18th century. We've walked our way through here. By the way, this is just a little bit before when Karl Marx is about to be born, and we'll start to head into the influence of Darwin's teaching as well. We're still 150 years before World War I, but we've talked about the Enlightenment, capitalism, all those things. And so we come into this influence of this young Brit member of Parliament, William Wilberforce. He was born in 1759. He came from elite society, educated at Cambridge, where he was not a good student. He was known for being quite the party hound. He's also known for being ambitious. And shortly after he graduates from Cambridge, he uses his ambition and his connections to secure a seat in Parliament. He is 21 years of age, and according to his later writings, he did absolutely nothing worthy of a member of Parliament. He said, "The first years in Parliament, I did nothing to any purpose. My own distinction was my darling object." So his own fame and fortune was what he was focused on. But at some point, he begins to reflect on his life, which led to a period of intense sorrow. He said, quote, "No human creature could suffer more than I did for some months." And then this unnatural gloom was lifted on Easter 1786. Quote, "Amidst the general chorus with which all nature seems on such a morning to be swelling the song of praise and thanksgiving, he experienced spiritual rebirth." He decided at that point to abstain from alcohol and engage in, quote, "rigorous self-examination." He abhorred who he had become. He abhorred all the things that he was doing. the endless dinner parties, which he thought were full of vain and useless conversation. They disqualify me for every useful purpose in life, waste my time, impair my health, fill my mind with thoughts of resistance before and self-condemnation afterwards. So he began to see that his life's purpose was to be a public one, that he had obviously already achieved some public notoriety being a member of Parliament. My business is the world, he wrote. I must mix in the assemblies of men or quit the post which Providence seems to have assigned to me. In particular, two causes caught his attention. The main one being slavery. So he will also do this whole thing, and he'll write a big long book about the refinement of manners and civil discourse, by which he meant a lot more than sort of table etiquette. He meant culture and how culture needs to be refined. And I used to not think very much of that side of Wilberforce. I think now it's much more profoundly important than I thought. But he fell under the influence of a man named Thomas Clarkson, who was profoundly mobilizing, was a profound influence in mobilizing lots of people to fight slavery. Wilberforce will later write, "So enormous, so dreadful, so irredeemable did the trade's wickedness appear that my own mind was completely made up for abolition. Let the consequences be what they would. I, from this time, determined that I would never rest until I had effected its abolition." After coming to faith, Wilberforce thought about dropping out of Parliament, and I mentioned John Newton, the slave trader, become Christian, become pastor, become the author of Amazing Grace. He told him not to, and he told Wilberforce to take up the cause of abolition, and that is what Wilberforce did. And Wilberforce was initially optimistic. He thought that he could get this done. And if you read about his life, what you're going to see is that Wilberforce will spend the rest of his life fighting slavery. And initially the votes, I wrote a paper on this some time ago, and I remember initially the votes are whatever, they're like 200 to 3. And 100, and then it's 198 to 5. And Wilberforce just keeps going and going and going year after year after year. He's little Johnny One Note. He keeps championing the cause of abolition. And it will take his entire life. It'll be 25 years of working on this in Parliament. And he will eventually see that the slave trade will be outlawed in the British in certain sections, and then it'll be outlawed throughout the entire British Empire. And then he's not yet seen before he dies, but he has reason to believe that it is coming, the freeing of the slaves. So initially he's fighting slave trafficking locally, and then he's fighting it in all of the British Empire, which is 25% of the world at that point, and then he's fighting for the freedom. So there's other things to be noted about Wilberforce. He's really a fascinating guy to read about. As I said, he also wrote this other book in which he was fighting against the profanity of culture and the coarsening of culture and the decline of civility. He will join, and we'll look at this in a little while, in 1797, in future podcasts, he's going to settle into the Clapham sect and become a prominent member of this. It's a number of devout Christians who sort of all decide to work together on a handful of issues. He is going to do all of this in spite of poor health virtually his entire life. He had all kinds of issues. He was never a robustly healthy guy. He was sort of a small man, sickly much of the time. But he is going to spend his life and his breath fighting the slave trade. And in a great providential moment, he will stand on one of the last times in Parliament, and they said that the clouds part and a sunbeam comes in and lands on him, and he gives his speech again. And overwhelmingly, the members of Parliament have now been persuaded by life, by rhetoric, by what they've learned, by Wilberforce, and they vote to end the slave trade. So there's much that we could learn from this whole topic. I think we should learn that it's possible for us and for large sections of society to be blind to certain problems, societal sin. We can learn that a small group of people can prevail against greater forces if they are committed. We can learn that when society changes, it often changes very quickly. So that's what happened with this. It was no, 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 and then it was a big yes. So once you reach a tipping point, it tips. I think we should be sober to ask ourselves, given all that Wilberforce did with his life, what am I doing with my life? So much to learn about this, many more things to think about, but that's it for this podcast. When we come back, the next podcast, I guess that'll be 62, it's going to be on Edmund Burke and conservatism. I said that was going to be this one, got out of order. See you then.